Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and this is a sort of garvapsi in some senses for Navdeep Singh Suri. He was ambassador here, brilliant ambassador here in the years 2016, 2019. You were ambassador to the UAE, and apart from that, this area is familiar territory to you. You've also been ambassador to Egypt, and of course Australia earlier that, and a huge amount of stints on other areas that's there. And so appreciative has the UAE been of your services. You were conferred the Order of Zayed II, which is the country's second highest civilian award. Let's welcome Navdeep Singh Suri to the India Today Conclave.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You know, this session is titled Geopolitics. And when I first approached Navdeep to come fly down here and share his thoughts, he said, let's talk about UAE. And I said, no, let's talk about geopolitics. And then we were sitting at lunch today, and he started talking about UAE in a way that I'd never listened and never heard about. So what I'm going to do is, we're going to kick off with this conversation with your insights in UAE, because my memory of UAE was that I flew in, I was covering Khomeini's funeral in Iran. This was, I think, 1987. And when I came to Dubai, at that time it was a what would you say, a one-port town and you know, small in its thing. And the only thing attractive about it was the electronic goods that you could buy cheaper. And then, of course, hope that the customs guys wouldn't catch you as you cross the border and have to pay, once you landed up in India, and pay 100% duty or whatever it is. So that was the early things. Tell us a little bit about the umbilical cord India and UAE has. And what is the history and the interest that keeps us together as we look ahead and look at the future, the past?
Well, thanks, Raj. I think when you talk about the past, it's really a dilemma. How far back do you go? Because, His Highness, the ruler of Sharjah, has produced a 12-volume compendium that looks at the Portuguese period and the relations during that period between India and the Gulf, broadly speaking. From the 12th, 13th century, in Calicut, you had the Zamorin as the ruler, who was one of those original free traders, and the series of rulers from Calicut really invited merchants to come to that coast of Malabar coast and set up establishments over there. They would, I think, from the time of Ahmad ibn Majid, the famous Arab navigator from around Ras Al Khaimah, they had mastered the monsoon winds, that they would come at a certain point reliably. You could ride the winds, come fairly quickly from the Gulf to the western coast of India, spend 3-4 months there, and then go back. So, you have that old history of trading links, which carried products from particularly the Malabar coast into the Roman Empire via the Gulf. But if you come to more recent times, I think one of the defining periods was kind of between 1860s, 70s till the 1920s, when the largest economic activity between India and this country was the pearl trade. Right. Pearls had become fashionable in Victorian England, and then with the rising prosperity in America, they had suddenly become the fashion statement. And of course, there were the Maharajas and Nawabs in India. And the finest pearls used to come from the shallow banks around where we are today. It's not surprising that at that point of time, 90% of the GDP of this area used to come from pearls. One estimate is that virtually every able-bodied man was involved in pearl diving or in supplying the boats or in trading. And here's the interesting thing, that during that period, all of the trade was really run by the Bhatia community from Sindh, from a small place called Thatta. They had settled here, and the merchants would come, they would fund the captain of the boat to buy the supplies, spend 3 months out on the high seas to do the diving. They would come back, and again it was those merchants who would buy the pearls and take them to Mumbai, where they were polished and processed for sale into the global markets. So that's the kind of relationship that we, I think, have forgotten about. But there's one other period that I want to mention, which is that if you look at the whole notion of the trucial states, called the trucial states because there was a trucial agreement that the British instigated that stopped fighting between the various sheikdoms of that period. From 1829 till effectively 1959, the legal tender here was the Indian rupee, right? That's the only currency that people knew. That was the only currency in which business was done. And we forget that all of the treaties, starting with the 1821 treaty with the sheikhs to the 1829 Maritime Agreement, all of these treaties were under the jurisdiction of the governor in Bombay. The reporting relationship, in a sense, of the British political agents in Basra, in Sharjah, in Bahrain, was to Bombay, not to London. This was the umbilical cord that linked the two geographies across the Arabian Sea.
Fascinating. And when did it actually, we also remembered Dubai for gold smuggling, right? I mean, there's something of a hoary past that existed between us. And you always bought this gold from Dubai and took it into India, and then the rise of the entire crime syndicates. And when did this act start getting cleaned up? And when did Dubai transform itself to this gleaming city, and what really propelled it in your analysis?
So I think it's a really fascinating story of the whole gold fever in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, wonderfully captured by a bunch of Bollywood films, from Diwar to Company to others, which made Haji Mastan and others into the characters that they were. I think that's all part of our growing up imagination, right? But at a more serious note, if you look at the pre-1947 period, until India became independent, we were largely, both the Gulf and India, were part of a British-dominated maritime and trade ecosystem. You had a lot of trading links between Basra, Dubai, Sharjah, Bahrain, and Bombay. All the connections were here, from here were to Bombay. 1947, India becomes independent. We want to conserve foreign exchange because it's scarce, and we are a very poor country at that time. And we put a Gold Control Act. And suddenly, you have national sovereign borders to trade in a zone that never knew these borders.
Right.
So you have a huge difference of perception through the 50s and 60s, where what was smuggling for India as contravention of our national laws was regular trading activity from the entrepreneurs of Dubai in particular, for whom, hey, we import the gold,
right,
and we export it, and we are doing no harm. Huge fortunes were made during that period. One very senior member of the royal family told me of a particularly enterprising Dubai businessman who actually bought a decommissioned German U-boat for his particular activity. A conversation with another lady whose father was a very prominent businessman in Dubai, unfortunately no more, vividly recalls taking a very large shipment of gold to Bombay. There was a Coast Guard interception. Right. And the whole consignment was dumped into the sea. And he swears that if somebody were to put some money together to get some divers and high-tech equipment, you would find the proverbial pot of gold off the shores of Bombay.
Fascinating, Titanic kind of story on this one. So when did this change to a glistening steel, glass, prosperous Dubai or UAE?
So let me take you back because it's relevant for today. During the pearl diving period, the center of the pearl trade was a place called Linge, which is across the Gulf in present-day Iran. In 1906, there was a change in regime in Linge, and the ruler of Linge decided to impose tariffs. Right? Tariffs have been...
There was Donald Trump.
Right?
He wasn't there that
But
time.
the consequences are interesting.
Right.
Sheikh Hajar, who was the great-grandfather of the present-day ruler, promptly sent a delegation across to Linge saying, hey, I believe you guys have some problems. Why don't you come to Dubai, and I will make sure that you get the most business-friendly, most tax-free environment anywhere. In 1906, he managed to attract that original group of Indian merchants from Linge to Dubai. He managed to attract...
When you say Linge, where is Linge?
Just across from Dubai in Iran.
Iran, okay.
Right? Literally across the Gulf.
Right.
So he managed to pull those in. And the rest, as they say, is history, because nobody remembers Linge, and everybody knows Dubai today, which continues to do the same thing. It benefits from the mistakes of others and the troubles of others to become the magnet that it is. We impose the taxes on gold, they benefit from it. There's an uncertainty or volatility somewhere, they benefit from it, and they've managed to retain this cachet as this free-wheeling, entrepreneurial, very laissez-faire kind of economy.
And that's the curiosity that one needs to look at, because in India, we are a majority, but we have a minority complex. Here, if you look at it, you know, the Emirati is like 10% of the population. The Indians are 40%. The Pakistanis must be about 20%, and other nationalities that is there. What is their secret of their success that they're able to have this kind of diverse population, not feel threatened by the influx? Anywhere else, there would have been political unrest and everything else. What makes the Emiratis so acceptable of the cultures from others and live with it and prosper?
Well, one theory when you talk to old families here is that coastal communities traditionally, most places in the world, tend to be more open and more receptive to foreign cultures, more tolerant towards foreign influences, as compared to insular communities. For example, when you talk to old families here, they will have a certain attitude towards Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, saying, hey, we would never go down that road, and we tried our best to keep that influence away, which is true. And so you have that whole culture of openness, which goes with being a trading entrepreneur, right? And this is something that you see in Kerala, you see in other places. But I think along with that are two crucial components. One is there is the self-confidence that we are in control. And the second is there is a very high-tech security network that makes sure that people who come here don't bring their politics and their feuds and their attitudes into this country. And that's why you see that communities that in the past have tried to be reckless in bringing their feuds here find that they're at the receiving end of the stick.
Right.
It's a very tolerant society in religious terms, but it's a very strict society in terms of observance of the local rules and laws.
Interesting. And if we zoom out a bit and now look at how does UAE compare, you've got the other Gulf countries, you've Saudi Arabia, you've got Qatar, what is the uniqueness of the Emirati as compared to, and you've seen also, you've gone the other side and looked at Egypt. What makes them so different and unique? If you had to look at, since we are in the India-UAE Conclave, and I'm tapping your insights across the region.
You know, I think both our current ambassador, Sanjay Sudhir, and I have had the privilege of serving in Egypt.
Right.
And without wishing to cause any offense, I think being a 5,000-year-old civilization that Egypt is,
right,
also brings a certain sense of entitlement with it.
Right, like us also.
Maybe, perhaps to an extent.
You
said that.
Let's not forget.
But here, and the Egyptians used to have a very condescending attitude towards the Gulf. I remember from the 80s, when these countries had just started becoming wealthy with the oil boom post-1973 and so on, one of the famous Egyptian writers and intellectuals, who I won't name, wrote a very condescending piece called From the Camel to the Cadillac Syndrome, sneering at a generation that had moved from a camel to a Cadillac, right? What they have demonstrated is that they haven't taken a past for granted, and they are firmly focused on the future. You have a combination of, obviously, the wealth, but also great pragmatism in terms of the leadership. It's a very non-ideological, business-friendly leadership that has put in place the kind of policies that have enabled you to witness the miracle that you are witnessing. Dubai was the first off the mark, but today if you go to Abu Dhabi, literally every 5 years you see a transformation.
Correct. Yeah.
And in some ways, they've become the models for many other places to follow.
Which is a good point to look at. And the fact that you have a Singapore, you have a Hong Kong, you've got UAE, and of course some of the other Gulf countries. Again, if you take a comparative look at what makes Dubai prosper, you have Singapore, which is seen as, on the Far East as the best port to be around with. Does it seriously challenge any of these places? Is there any things that you've seen comparative that you could talk about?
I think Dubai started off by seeing Singapore as a role model. And wanted to emulate, and spent a fair bit of time studying the best practices in Singapore. Today, I would say, with all seriousness, that they would not only give Singapore a run for its money, but Singapore should be watching where they are going, because while Singapore in some ways is tightening up on visas for expatriates and foreign nationals and so on, Dubai is doing the opposite thing. UAE has introduced golden visas, right? In a country where traditionally you had 3 visas, today that golden visa has become a lure for talent and capital, and including some talent and capital that's leaving Singapore for these shores.
So let's peep into the future, and let's look at UAE. And you've studied it, and I think you're writing, the next book is going to be on UAE. So just peeping at the crystal ball and saying, where do you see UAE make the progress, and where do you see some of the challenges that it would face, given the geopolitics of the region?
I think UAE's biggest progress is going to be in technology and knowledge-driven industries, and in its very determined transition away from oil. You're going to continue seeing an acceleration of the trend where the oil is an important source of income, but there are increasingly other sources of revenue that are being very consciously and deliberately being cultivated, and industries that are being attracted. On the negative side, as we in India like to say, they also live in a tough neighborhood, and that comes with its challenges. I think over the last 5 or 7 years, you see a very conscious determination, particularly last 3 years, I would say, for the region as a whole, for the Saudis, for UAE, for Qatar, for Iran, to mend fences. So if you were to go back where we were 10 years back and where we are today, I'd say that the region today is more stable. Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking to each other. UAE and Iran are talking to each other. UAE and Qatar are talking. Turkey's a part of the equation and so on. So you'd say that today the region is in a more stable place than it was 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean that the fissures have vanished. Maybe some have been papered over temporarily. Maybe some are looking for more durable solutions. And that's a space that I think you will have to keep watching. But one of the things that UAE is trying to do in a very interesting way is to position itself as part of its natural geography, which is Asia.
Right.
Rather than, going into the Western camp to an extent that, this was a country that the British pretty much oversaw for 150 years. And the departure from that, therefore, is significant. It doesn't mean either or, but I think there's a consciousness that the geopolitical center of gravity is shifting to this part of the world, right. And UAE wants to be very much front and center in that.
Let me take you to two recent major developments in terms of the fact of multiple countries cooperating, whether the previous session talked of the India-Middle East corridor that's there, and of course the ITU-2. Now, the I is in trouble, and not India, but the I that we're looking at. And there's been a major blowout that's happened and continues to let's say, cause turbulence in the region. Where do you see, are these two major concepts that seem to be in a transformative space, is that now dead on one side? Or do you see a change happening, reconciliation? What would be that process of reconciliation? Because you cannot have strife and still have progress.
So there's no question that October 7 and the violent aftermath of October 7 have been a setback to some of the positive dynamics initiated by the Abraham Accords, of which ITU-2 and IMEC are, in a sense, products, but both were products born before October 7.
Correct.
And to that extent, I think, until the situation of Israel, until Israel finds a way of coming to peace with its neighbors in a mutually respectful manner, it will be an impediment to progress. That's my personal view. That some of the potential that's visible in ITU-2 or IMEC or other very ambitious programs at a sub-regional and sub-regional level will remain unrealized. But you live in a region where things can change very, very quickly. Who would have predicted that Iran and Saudi Arabia would have the situation that they do today? Who would have thought that UAE and Saudi Arabia or UAE and Turkey, after the bitterness that they went through, including violence at some level, who would have thought that? So I think one motto is never say never. And the second, which flows from that, is because you know that there's a certain logic to these things. With passage of time, they will settle down. I think what you're witnessing is what Ambassador Sanjay Sudhir and Rizwan and all mentioned, is that you continue to work on that which is possible and within your control, and hope that through the virtual trade corridor, through the mechanisms that you are establishing, you are also creating templates that can then be replicated as and when the other legs of the regional arrangement fall into place. You don't keep waiting, because these are by definition long-term, long gestation projects. So you don't have to wait for the last leg to be completed before you want to take the first step forward. You start taking the steps that will take you closer to the destination, and then hopefully by that time the other pieces would have fallen into place.
We started this discussion with the trade winds that brought UAE to India and back. And of course, the terminology monsoon comes from Mausam, which is what the seamen of the yore used to get across from this shore to that shore. There is another trade wind that is blowing, that is cyclonic in its term, and we had the gentleman who was creating that storm right here in Dubai today, Donald Trump.
Abu Dhabi.
Oh, Abu Dhabi, okay. Sorry, yes. UAE, let's be. So if you look at the impact that Trump is having and the kind of trade winds that he's blowing across, what would you see as the change that will happen in this region? How much would it be affected? Would the center of gravity shift somewhere else? What is your sense of that?
Let me say something counterintuitive. By and large, the victory of President Trump, both Trump 1.0 and 2.0, was welcomed and celebrated in this region.
Interesting.
And the reason was At the time of Trump 1.0, what I used to hear very frequently was that when President Obama's administration did the nuclear deal with Iran, they only did the nuclear deal. They forgot all the concerns that the countries of this region had vis-a-vis Iran's missile program, vis-a-vis Iran's interference as they perceived it into their internal affairs, its use of Shia minority communities to its ends and so on. There was this genuine disquiet that they, as Iran's neighbors, and the ones that had the biggest stake in Iran's behavior, had been left completely out of the consultative process, and the decisions had been taken by the P5+1 up north, as was the time used to be done in the 19th century. And this was not acceptable. So when President Trump actually revoked the nuclear agreement with Iran, there was considerable satisfaction here. I think that they see President Trump as mercurial, but somebody with whom they can do business. And I'm sure that they're going to find ways to work with the administration in unexpected areas that you may not see at this point of time. So I think the perception of President Trump here is going to be very different from the lament that you hear in Europe.
Despite the drill, baby, drill, and the oil that America, he hopes, would produce, that would challenge the Middle East, and they're not worried about it?
If oil prices remain below $60 a barrel, there's going to be no drill, baby, drill. And that oil is not viable at $60 a barrel.
So you don't see that, they don't perceive Trump as a threat of any kind?
No, look, I think there was a genuine concern towards the end of Trump 1.0 that because US was no longer dependent on oil from the Gulf, it was emerging as a nascent exporter of energy in its own right, that there was this pivoting towards Asia, there was this separation from the Gulf, from the Middle East in some ways. And it was visible when first Saudi Arabia, the Aramco facilities were attacked, and then Abu Dhabi itself became a target. And there was certainly an expectation from here and from Riyadh that there would be a more robust US response. And it didn't come. And there was a feeling here that, hey, what are those security understandings that we have with America, with all their bases in across the region? What are they worth in Doha, in Bahrain, in Dhafra, and so on, if they're not going to come to our assistance? And that's where you started seeing a conscious effort that, hey, we can't depend over there forever for our security requirements. Let's mend fences in our own region.
Right. Interesting.
And you saw that post-2019, the developments that happened. I think today, there's a greater realization of that, just as Europe is saying that we can't depend on US for our security blanket, but we still need the US in a bunch of other ways, and they are willing to put their money into areas that really appeal to President Trump and to take their interests forward. If it's the art of the deal that President Trump looks at, then that's something that this region is very conversant with.
Final question. We're out of time, but I'm going to ask you this. Oil was what brought riches to this region. Oil, in some senses, is still around, but in a diminishing thing if you look at the sustainable movement that has happened across. Of course, Trump has put a bomb on that, but generally that movement towards greener energy is going to happen. How much countries, of course, UAE is not so dependent on its oil resources, but what would be the changes that you think will happen in the Gulf if, for instance, there's a de-emphasis in oil? Are they prepared for that change?
So first, that if needs to have a question mark, because even climate enthusiasts like me would say that it's going to be 20, 30 years before you're really going to see. You're seeing a transition, but it's going to be slower than most people think, unfortunately. And it's also, you're going to see more renewable energies coming into the mix without necessarily much less oil being pumped. So I think oil is going to coexist with renewables for at least the next 20, 30 years. I think Sheikh Zayed, as almost 25 years back, called his family and said, I want you to think of the day when the last barrel of oil has been pumped and get us ready for that. And that's the direction in which they've been working. It's quite fascinating that the 6th largest producer of oil in the world also has Masdar as one of the world's largest renewable energy companies, also has a nuclear power plant that provides 25% of its energy needs. I don't think they needed to do this. So there's a degree of conviction from which this transition away from oil is happening very consciously over a period of time. None of this is knee-jerk. None of this is, oh, because we did COP28. Al-Baraka nuclear facility has been, 15 years in the making, I think, since the time that the contract was awarded. So you can see that the genesis goes back almost half a generation. And a lot of people don't realize it because I think we consume the Western media and buy into the stereotype of the oil-rich sheikh. And we create almost this caricature of the man in the abaya, in the kandura, and the woman in the abaya, and whatever flows. And I think those stereotypes need to be shattered with a hammer because, we just so misunderstand what the reality of these countries is.
Navdeep Singh Suri, I know your heart is in Amritsar, but I think your mind continues to be in Abu Dhabi and in UAE. We wish you your book all the best when it comes out. But thank you so much for your insights. We've learned so much during the course of this half an hour. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, let's give him a very warm round of applause.